It's not that I wouldn't mind a few more people, but it's kind of nice to have a small class like this, just one-on-one. So tonight we'll talk about the precepts, and then next week we'll be on the paramitas. They're very similar. They're both guidelines for behavior, and they're very simple and direct. They provide a very simple and direct framework for maintaining the moral and ethical aspects of the Eightfold Path. Of course, they're not the whole path, but they're important. They're taught by the Buddha. Do you know who Jiddu Krishnamurti was?
No, I don't.
He's an interesting guy. I think he passed in 1991. He was. Do you know who the Theosophists were in the Theosophical Society?
Yeah.
Madame Blavatsky and C.W. Ledbetter et al.
Yeah.
So they kind of got it in their head that a future Buddha was about to be born. Mm-hmm. And they did this. I'll shorten it greatly, and it really doesn't relate to what I'm going to say tonight, but it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
So they took it upon themselves to discover this future Buddha who was just getting born. And they kind of traveled around. They through a series of eliminations, they decided on this boy that was just born to an Indian family from India, not Native American. Mm-hmm. And they convinced their parents, when the boy was very young, that they were going to teach him this was the future Buddha, let them come under their wing, and they would train him to be the savior. And which is really how they saw the Buddha. They had a very religious and mystical connotation about what a Buddha would be anyway. So they trained him in their belief in their Theosophist philosophy. And he started his ministry, if that's what you want to call it, around the age of 16. And he was very eloquent even at that age. And he was a strikingly handsome young man, even at 15 and 16 years old. So immediately he started getting a lot of followers. He was accepted in many circles as, this is going to be the future Buddha. And he did that for about 5 or 6 years until he was about 21 years old. And he started thinking about what he was doing and realizing that this really wasn't something that rang authentic to him. Mm-hmm. And so he left the Theosophists. But he continued to teach right until the day he died. And he wrote some really interesting books. Think on These Things is one of them that I always remember, but quite a few good books. And he said that if there was any religion that was worth following, it was Buddhism. But what he was referring to was actually the teachings of the Buddha. He wasn't enamored with modern Buddhism even back then, but he said that what the Buddha taught was something that was very useful. He was a meditator. He had a very simple approach to living in the world. My take on Krishnamurti was that he was likely an awakened human being, but the Buddha would describe him as a Pacceka Buddha, meaning someone who had awakened but doesn't understand how to teach others to awaken. And that's really what was lacking. He gave, in a conceptual way, he described what it would be like to live in the world as an awakened human being, free of conflict. But he didn't understand what the Buddha did, that most people's minds are so rooted in ignorance and conditioned by that ignorance that they need an eightfold path to awaken. He dismissed that, or maybe I shouldn't even say he dismissed it. He never felt that it was important at all, so he didn't teach it. But he wrote a lot of good things. He started a school in England that's still there today, based on his principles and his understanding. So he's a remarkable man. He deserves a look. And the reason why I said all that is I quote him to begin this, and it relates to just what we're talking about. So Jiddu Krishnamurti often said, and he did. There's still talks on on YouTube, etc. And he would say this so often: look at the lives you're living. And on the surface, that sounds, well, that's a good idea, but I probably do it anyway. But what he was saying was, in a very mindful way, to look at the lives you're living, and if it's not the life you want to live, change it. So he was implying that we have the ability to change our relationship with the world around us, which is very similar to what the Buddha taught. Again, he didn't teach the path to change that. He just kind of said change it, using himself as an example. But again, he had thousands and thousands and thousands of followers at his peak, and really up to the time he died, there were many people. And like I said, I read all of his books. So he was stressing the importance of being mindfully present in thought, word, and deed in our interaction with others and with ourselves, as a way of integrating the Four Noble Truths into our daily lives, and as a simple and effective way of being mindful of how we relate to the phenomenal world. The Buddha gave us precepts. Precepts are simply principles for conduct. By following these precepts in thought, word, and deed, we are living within the framework of the Eightfold Path. In other words, we are using the Eightfold Path to look at the lives we're living, and using the Eightfold Path as a reference for that, for what's occurring. And so by doing that, and you've had this experience, you've done this, by integrating the Eightfold Path, we start developing a more realistic or right view of the world simply by integrating the path. In other words, there's nothing else that has to be done. There's no mystical experiences that we have to encounter. There's nothing that has to be bestowed on us. Within the framework of the Eightfold Path, we learn to develop a realistic way of looking at the world. The Buddha described it as right view. And these precepts are simply guidance for behavior within the framework of the Eightfold Path. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The Buddha taught these precepts. Now that I said I'm going to skip ahead, I'm going to skip back a little bit. The Buddha taught 5 precepts for lay people. And then for those that were on retreat, he would teach three more additional ones. And those 8 precepts are often used as guidance in many retreats today. They're often brought out in the beginning. But again, usually often lacking the full direction of the Eightfold Path. And then those that take vows, monastic vows, in most schools, there's at least 200 more precepts that you agree to. Interestingly, usually women have more than men, and I won't get too deep into that, but that was even going all the way back to the beginning. It wasn't that women's behavior was so out of control that they needed more precepts. It was that they needed to be mindful of their effect on the men, the monks around them, and to act accordingly. So as not to entice the men. Really was unfair to put it on the women, though, wasn't it? But that was the case, and it's still the case today.
Still the case,
In
some cases.
Women usually were able to practice much more restraint than men, but maybe that was because it was put on them. They could do it, where most men couldn't. So the 5 precepts are: refrain from killing or taking life, act with goodwill and loving kindness. Number 2, refrain from stealing or taking what is not freely given. Be generous. Refrain from false, unnecessary, misleading, harmful, or impatient speech. Speak with kindness, honesty, and mindfulness. Number 4, refrain from sexual misconduct or using sex in a selfish or harmful manner. Be content in giving. And number 5, refrain from the use of intoxicants, so to remain mindful and thoughtful. All just practical advice. But the Buddha felt it was necessary to emphasize these things because he saw how people were struggling, even with a Buddha teaching them, because they were still stuck in these conditioned behaviors. And if you can't address these behaviors, this is something that is fundamental. If you can't deal with this, if you can't address these types of behaviors, there's no way you can develop the Eightfold Path. This is so fundamental. And that doesn't mean that we have to be perfect in our behavior or saint-like. We simply have to be willing to recognize this behavior that is hurtful and abandon it as part of the path. So the Eightfold Path is a path of virtue, concentration, and wisdom. And by being mindful of behavior in relation to these simple precepts, you will develop more virtuous lives. This itself will deepen your meditation practice, developing deeper concentration. As you become more mindful of virtue and concentration, wisdom deepens. Wisdom is further developed and expressed by living life within the gentleness that comes from following these precepts. So there's no way that we can develop an authentic Dhamma practice if we're not looking at our own behavior. And most of us aren't, we don't come to Dhamma practice as murderers or as thieves. But there's so many stories in the Sutta Pitaka of just those types of individuals. Angulamila comes to mind, but many others, who were examples of the most egregious types of behavior. But when they came to the Dhamma, the first thing they did was address that behavior, and then they developed the Dhamma. And by doing so, Angela Mill is another good example. He very quickly awakened once he realized the extreme hurtfulness of his behavior. And after that first encounter with the Buddha on the road, he never acted that way again. And it was first addressing that awful behavior that allowed him to very quickly develop the Dhamma. So just a good example. On the surface, these precepts are fairly easy to abide by, but as you look deeper at your intentions and intentional actions, you may become aware of subtle aspects of clinging, craving, desire, and aversion, keeping you stuck in conditioned thinking. For example, do you hold a persistent view of yourself or others that is not in keeping with these precepts? So it's often that we'll address the sins, putting a little Christian bent, we'll address the sins in others. We'll notice egregious behavior in others, but we won't notice it in ourselves. When that is just another good strategy to ignore our own ignorance. These must be applied to ourselves, and then it really doesn't matter how other people are acting. Another form of killing that I make note of: do you engage in character assassination, including what you're saying to yourself? That's so important. We often, because we are initially in Dhamma practice, our thoughts and our views are objectified. They're outside of ourselves. That we first apply it outside or with our interactions with others. It's much easier to do that than to recognize how we're sabotaging ourselves, how we're acting in very hurtful ways towards ourselves. And so these precepts are to be directed at ourselves. I'm not going to say primarily, but initially as well. Mm-hmm. We can't continue to be harsh with ourselves and expect to not be harsh with others. Are your thoughts free from aggressive and hurtful thoughts towards others or towards yourself? Do you try to kill another spirit through hurtful comments or imposing negative views of self? It's all, to me, that's all forms of killing. This is my comments, by the way. This isn't the Buddha's words. Do you gossip or tell small lies? Do you treat sex as a mindful expression of generosity or simply a means of satiating your own desires? Do you take, even emotionally, what is not freely given? Do you obsessively or addictively use drugs, alcohol, TV, food, yoga, golf, work, or anything else to escape the reality of your life? And we all know, most of us know all about that. Obsessive behavior of any kind is an expression of discursive conditioned thinking caused by the manifestations of craving and clinging, caused by what the Buddha identified as a second noble truth. While the initial guidance gained from the precepts is very important, careful consideration of each precept will reveal a much deeper and broader application, and the application of the precepts will differ for everyone. For example, we all agree that the intentional taking of another human being's life is wrong. But is killing still wrong in the context of war? What about the killing of animals as a food source? Now, every now and then I'll probably get some emails about this. That we should never kill any animals. There are entire populations of people that if they didn't eat meat, they simply would die off because they live in northern climates. There's simply not enough vegetables to live on, and they need the fat that's in animals to survive. So in that situation, no, it's not wrong to kill animals. It's wrong to kill animals as a sport. When you understand where that sport is coming from, it's your self-aggrandizement. I want to get the biggest buck in the world and hang it on my wall. That's obviously wrong. There's no value in taking that life. And even during one of the big misunderstandings of the Buddha is that he was a complete vegetarian. He never ate animals. That's completely not true. He ate animals just like everyone else. When he went on his alms round and somebody gave him a little bit of lamb instead of rice, he was grateful for it. He took it gracefully and he ate it. Maybe it's ironic that the thing that killed the Buddha, that caused his demise, was eating some bad pork that Kunda gave him. But that's not to say he shouldn't have been a meat eater. Taking that a little further, is it wrong to step on a bug or pluck a tick off of a pet? Some people would say so. These questions need to be answered in accordance with each individual's own mindful conscience and will more likely change over time and as Dhamma practice develops. There was a time in my life when I didn't, if I saw a bug on the floor, I would step on it. Because that was my reaction. Now, when I do, I try to get the bug out of the house, as best as I can. But that's something that evolved. And if someone started beating me up over stepping on an ant when I wasn't mindful of why I was doing it, I probably never would have changed. I would have been so conditioned in that way. But when I find a tick on my dog, it's my responsibility to take it off and not let that dog get stepped in. He is my responsibility. So there's no clear-cut way of saying you never should kill anything. It's just not practical. It is quite obvious that these precepts describe an enlightened way of living. The precepts as an aid and truthfully a necessity to Dhamma practice may not be immediately apparent. The awareness gained by Dhamma practice will enhance your awareness of the precepts and a more skillful way of living. Living mindfully with the precepts will greatly enhance overall Dhamma practice, and it's just a simple thing to incorporate into our lives. When you bring yourself to your cushion to sit, you bring all of you. It is much more difficult to realize your true and unfettered self when you are bothered by thoughts of unskillful actions. The more you can adhere to the guidelines of the precepts, the more peaceful your life will be, and the more loving your relationships will be, and the closer you will be to expressing your mindfulness. From an entirely liberated view, the precepts lead to being mindful of how you can enhance the life experience of others and free yourself from discursive conditioned behavior. You learn how to use your speech in a loving and compassionate way to bring healing and liberation to yourself and others. Your sexual relations are characterized by gentleness and giving. You develop great generosity of spirit. You keep your body pure and your mind clear, resulting in well-concentrated virtuous acts arising from wisdom. Meditation practice develops concentration and insight of conditioned thinking. Holding in mind, being mindful of the Eightfold Path and the precepts, you are able to remain mindful of conditioned thinking and how conditioned thinking arises in your daily life. As less than skillful thoughts, words, and deeds arise while maintaining mindfulness of the precepts, in this present moment, you are able to clearly see the results of clinging, craving, and desire, simply by being mindful of the precepts, and which also allows for us to be human beings. In other words, these aren't the 10 Commandments. If we break one of these precepts, we're not going to burn in hell or even maybe spend time in purgatory, which used to really scare me. They're simply guidelines to recognize that I'm acting in a way that is not skillful towards myself or for others. What do I do with it? Simply recognize it and abandon that behavior. That's the essence of mindfulness. That's why we use mindfulness. With this insight, you are now able to put these distracting and discursive mind states completely aside. You are able to clearly see the results of clinging, craving. No, I'm sorry, I read that. Your very life, moment by moment, becomes Dhamma practice. You stay present with whatever mind state arises without aversion, gaining deeper and deeper insight into your own mind. Ultimately, through a complete practice of integrating the Eightfold Path into your life and being mindful of these precepts, you are able to recognize all conditioned thinking. An effective way of incorporating these precepts into your life is to spend a few minutes during your sitting practice to review mindfully how you have practiced these principles in your daily life. When you start your day, you can develop the strong intention to keep the precepts and to be mindful of them. And it's very simple to bring this in to our meditation practice. And how is my behavior in relation to these precepts? And of course, when we're doing that with the virtuous factors of the Eightfold Path, we're doing basically the same thing. Being mindful of these basic precepts in your life will greatly increase your awareness of less than skillful thoughts and actions. Being mindful of your present moment's thoughts, words, and deeds is key to deepening insight into your mind and putting aside conditioned thinking. Unpleasant or agitated mind states that arise, whether fleeting or persistent, are all born of desire. Desire is a reaction due to ignorance of Four Noble Truths. Out of a perceived need to be different than you are in this present moment, a choice is made that more of what brings pleasure should be pursued and what brings unpleasantness should be avoided. Avoidance or aversion is also pursuit through worry, self-doubt, harsh judgments, and fear. Aversion is a desire that a past or present experience be different than experience, or a desire that a future event be different than expected. Holding in mind negative mind states is mindfulness arising from conditioned thinking. So again, mindfulness simply means to recognize or to hold in mind. We certainly do that with conditioned thinking. That's really the problem, is that we are tenaciously mindful of these things that are ignorant of Four Noble Truths. The Buddha's teachings of mindfulness is to be tenaciously mindful of the Eightfold Path. So to recognize that type of behavior. And these precepts are a simple and easy and direct access to that type of mindfulness simply by holding in mind. Holding in mind negative mind states is mindfulness arising from conditioned thinking. This unskillful mindful pursuit leads to more craving and aversion and more delusional thinking. Often being mindful of negative mind states is viewed as a way of understanding how these mind states were caused. A singular phenomenal cause is impossible to determine. What I'm referring to there is a lot of the insight that's taught in modern Buddhism, and I would say maybe in kind of the New Age philosophy, is that we should analyze our behaviors and pick them apart and figure out where they come from and maybe who to blame and what situation caused this and how wrong it is. The Buddha never teaches that, and that's just reinforcing that type of thinking when we analyze these things too much. It's enough to simply recognize the behavior. And these are simple guidelines. The guidelines of the precepts or the guidelines found in right speech, right action, and right livelihood are simple and direct. There's no analysis needed. It's simply recognizing them and abandoning them. That analysis or that false application of insight simply creates more of a diversion and more of a mind rooted in that ignorance. A simple way of saying that is what you focus on expands. And that's kind of a universal law. The Buddha understood that. So what we should focus on, what we want to expand, is our integration of the Eightfold Path. Using anything else is just a diversion from focusing on what's most important, being mindful of what's most important. And that's why a singular phenomenal cause is impossible to determine. I think you remember on retreat, we got into trying to find a root cause of ignorance or even a root cause of us. Where do we come from? Getting lost in past life views as a kind of an explanation of why things are happening in this life. The Buddha said, don't do any of that. In fact, in that series we went through recently about what the Buddha taught and why he taught with Vajragota, Anurata, Malankaputta, and Nakula Sakaka Sutta, and those great questions of who am I, where am I going, where have I come from? Those are all related to this, and they're all a distraction. We cannot find a root cause for where we come from or a root cause from our ignorance. It's impossible. It's just another dead end, but it's also another huge distraction when we try to do that. And unfortunately, a lot of insight is pointed towards that. We try to figure this out. I was going to get into the Abhidhamma is, I have to get into it now. The Abhidhamma is written in a way to try to explain something that the Buddha said you should just stay away from it. It's just a distraction. So that same thing, trying to find a singular cause for why I am ignorant of the Four Noble Truths, or why I'm so angry, or why am I so sad, or why am I this, or why, it's impossible. The only way to change it is simply to recognize this is what's occurring right now. Because what's occurring right now is the only thing that we can change. Not how I was or how I got here or how I might be tomorrow. How am I in this moment? And the precepts in the Eightfold Path help us define clearly who we are in this present moment through our behavior. And ultimately that behavior is rooted in how we think. So as we're using this, what we're developing is a clear understanding of how our thoughts are driving our behavior. And when we can understand that, then we can gain true understanding of mindfulness and using what we hold in mind to bring us awakening. Attempting to isolate a specific singular cause will only lead to more discursive thinking. All stress arises from manifestation of desire, and once acknowledged within the context of the Eightfold Path and the precepts, insight arises and the reaction of conditioned mind is interrupted. By following these 5 precepts, you will develop a moral and ethical life liberated and free from harmful actions and reactions. You will be able to develop deeper levels of skillful mindfulness. Through mindfulness of the Four Noble Truths, including the Eightfold Path, and by holding in mind these precepts, you are placing mindful awareness on the path of liberation and freedom and ceasing mindfulness of stress-causing desire. There's a little more to that, but I think that's enough for tonight. Thank you for listening, Kevin. And again, next week we'll get into the paramitas. But I think that's enough for tonight, huh?
Yeah.
So how's your practice and what do you think of tonight's class? Do you find it helpful?
I do. These precepts, I always regard this in right action. They are said to be the 5 basic right actions.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting how it does really meld with the rest of the path. They are actions, but they are also are mindfulness, and they also are right view. They also are they help you. If you have to have right effort to maintain them. I mean, it just sort of all hangs together in the Eightfold Path as well.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting to me how practical the Buddha's teachings were. And this is something that he taught in so many. I mean, you could say that every teaching related to the precepts too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And as they relate to the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths and dependent origination. Because this is what the Buddha is teaching. He's not teaching anything mystical or magical. He's not interested about gaining some advantageous future life. He's interested in teaching us as human beings, whose minds are initially rooted in ignorance, how to have a human life that is always at peace, always equanimous, creating no conflict within ourselves or outside of ourselves. As the Buddha described in Awakened Human Beings, quality of mind is at peace. And it's at peace because they understand in a profound way the nature of suffering and how they had in the past contributed to that suffering in themselves and in the world. Just practical teaching.
Each day, at least once a day, I review the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. After I meditate, I guess it prepares me for my next meditation. It prepares me for my day as well.
Yeah.
And I go over the 5 steps or the 5 right actions. In the past few days, my morning meditations have been very absorptive, I want to say. I just really, this morning I had extra time, and when I set my timer for half hour, the chime set, I found I was so deeply absorbed, I just turned off my alarm quickly, and then thought I have to sit here a few more moments, and I sat for another 20 minutes. It was very, almost transcending thought in a way, just like it is said in the teachings, the jhanas and the absorptions, and it felt very good. We're not supposed to crave that, but when it's happening, you realize the depth of this and how, after doing this for a certain amount of time, you can start to see what the Buddha is talking. You can start to feel what the Buddha was talking about. And then if you could do that all the time, it would be amazing.
Yeah, well, and recognizing the pleasant abiding is good to do. I mean, even the Buddha talks about that. It's important. That's why he taught the jhanas, simply so that we would be aware of it. And that's exactly how he describes the ever deepening levels of meditative absorption, is ever deepening levels of a pleasant abiding. It's what we're striving for. And the way you're describing it is not something that's leading to grasping. In other words, that you can't wait to have it again. It's a natural consequence. And again, that's how the Buddha described the jhanas. They're simply ordinary but profound levels, ever deepening levels of meditative absorption. And you described the 4th level beautifully there. A mind that is resting in equanimity. That's what it is. And the more we do that on our cushion, the more we can take it off our cushion. Right from the beginning, though, that was your practice, though, wasn't it, Kevin? To really begin immediately to integrate the Four Noble Truths in the Eightfold Path. Yes. And the benefits are incredible, aren't they? And it's simple. It's accessible.
I'd say right at the very beginning, mainly it was meditation, but very quickly, I guess really from, very soon when I started to read about where it fit, then it was all about.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that. If you don't mind me,
yeah.
That you were you really described first just intellectually, just learning to memorize them, what they are.
Yeah.
That's how we do it. And then once we know what they are, then we can integrate our behavior within that framework. That's exactly how the Buddha taught to do it. And the benefits are awakening. The benefits are full human maturity, and it works.
Yeah.
It's all practical stuff.
If I may, and if you can define that, you've mentioned that there are 3 other precepts to abide by in retreat.
Oh, now I got to hear it.
Now, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I was just thinking, wow, what are they? Now?
They have to do with, now I got to remember it. Usually one of the precepts will be that you'll only eat 1 meal a day.
Okay.
And again, it's not to, even that is a practical thing. It's not that we need to restrict our food for any reason. It has many practical applications. One is that we don't have to supply a lot of food for people.
Mm-hmm.
Another is that we don't have to have somebody cooking 3 meals a day.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing is so that we don't become distracted by our meals. We don't do that up at One Dharma Center, but
Sure, good,
yeah. Well, I'm glad we don't. I could never do that up there.
Yeah.
The other one has to do with a typical, even though you might have a retreat or a monastery where there's monks and nuns, you're very circumspect about your relationship. It's not that the women stay with the women and the men stay with the men. The understanding or the precept is to just remain within yourself. And I can't remember what that's called. And the third one escapes me. But some of the rule, I don't want to get it. Some of the
I've read the 2, not every one, but I've read about the 200. They are.
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, it is.
There are certain, you need to include like certain times of the month. Reciting all the rules is one of the rules.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Just so you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
There's a interesting sutta where I think it's Moggallana asked the Buddha, how come, might be Sariputta, we asked the Buddha, how come there's more rules, Vinaya, now than there were before? And the Buddha's answer was that people are just simply becoming more distracted. And so we need more rules. So initially there really wasn't any rules. There was simply the Eightfold Path. But as the Sangha grew and there was more and more influence from the outside world, the Buddha realized that we need to have rules for conduct outside of simple practical rules. But then some of them, there was one of the Vinaya rules was that you couldn't empty your chamber pot off a roof. The reason was very practical. There was a dignitary coming to visit the Buddha one day, and he happened to be walking next to a building when somebody decided to empty their chamber pot, and it landed on this dignitary. Mm-hmm. The next day there was a rule: you can't do that anymore. That's again just practical teachings. And none of these things are meant to be restrictive. Although people that people don't want to practice restraint can often be turned off by even something like this. It sounds a little too religious, but you don't understand that this is to your benefit. It's not, again, there's no supreme being that's going to strike you down if you do something. You're the one that's going to suffer from this. And you're not the only one. To acknowledge that your poor behavior brings suffering to others. That's as important as anything else. So again, just practical advice. Next week, you'll see that the paramitas are similar, but they relate more to a quality of mind rather than instruction for behavior. But the end result is the same. You could say that they're coming at the paramitas come at behavior from a conscious point of view, a mindful point of view, rather than just a direct action. It'll be next week. Any other questions or comments? That's another nice thing about small classes. We get done early. Thank you, Kevin. We'll finish as we usually do with the Karaniya Metta Sutta. So again, gently close your eyes and gently close your mouth and take a moment to become mindful of your in-breath and your out-breath. And these are the Buddha's words on metta from the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is what should be done by one who is skilled in goodness and who knows the path of peace. Let them be able and upright, straightforward and gentle in speech, humble and not conceited, contented and easily satisfied, unburdened with duties, and frugal in their ways, peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. Wishing and gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, medium, short, or small, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. Radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will. Whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world. Thank you, Kevin, for a wonderful class tonight. Peace. Say hello to all the